Greg. I'm from I'm at La Trobe University doing my PhD, but I'm going to talk a little bit today about some stuff I did in New Zealand as well as the stuff that I'm doing my PhD on. And so the title of my talk is Tracking and Modeling Landscape Change Through Time with GIS. And so we'll go over some basics first. What do I mean when I say landscape change? I'm talking about natural cultural processes such as coastal erosion, sea level rise, mining, and urban development. So large-scale changes that took place to the world around us. And for those who don't know, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. And it's sort of like Google Earth, but much more powerful. And so it's mapping software that's useful for archaeologists that are working, or researchers that are working on landscape scales. So it's really good software that we can use for our research that allows us to investigate things like landscape change. And so I've got a couple case studies. So slide. So I've got a couple of case studies where I'll go over this. So why is understanding landscape change useful for archaeologists? So archaeological sites exist within a landscape, and so they're affected by changes to that landscape. And understanding those landscape changes can help archaeologists to interpret what they cover when they're excavating and they find things within that landscape again. So, and it can also help archaeologists to better manage cultural heritage, whether that means protecting it by leaving it alone and not digging it up, or carefully excavating it before it's destroyed by either natural or cultural processes. And I'll provide some examples of those natural or cultural processes now. So I've got two case study areas. The first one we'll be looking at is in New Zealand. And so we'll be looking at sea level rise and erosion. And so the map on the left shows that there's two separate areas. So those of you from New Zealand and Otago University, I know there's a couple, will be familiar with these areas. But the top circle is Blueskin Bay, which you can see on the right side of the screen. Those two circles in that right map represent Maori settlement sites from the 14th century AD. And so these represent some of the earliest human settlement on the Otago coastline. So there are two sort of settlement sites there. And so the whole Blueskin Bay has about 26 recorded archaeological sites that range from areas that are soft shore and also areas that are a little bit higher elevation that are like sort of hard coast. So slide. And so I wanted to know what the effects of sea level rise would have on this part of the New Zealand coastline. And so we all know that sea level rise is this new future that we're facing and we're currently going through, but through climate change. And so I wanted to model it to figure out how these sites would be affected. So what I have on the left side is LiDAR collected in 2004 across the whole New Zealand coastline, at least for the Otago coastline, I should say. And so on the right side is an aerial image from 2013. And so LiDAR it allows you to create a digital reconstruction of a given landscape. And because it's digital, I can bring it into my computer GIS mapping software. And next slide. And using what we know is the current high tide just from our buoys and the ways of knowing how high tides are, I was able to model it. And so this is where current high tides are today. And then the worst case scenario, which will be the next slide, is when they increase by a meter. And so I visited all these sites and got GPS information for them. So then I was able to figure out which sites would be affected and where. And so this could help archaeologists to salvage archaeological sites that are at high risk of being inundated by the effects of sea level rise. So next slide. So this is moving on to our next case today, looking at coastal erosion. This is a photo taken at Papanui Inlet, also in Otago. And this is a big, thick deposit of midden. So this would have been a feast of people from hundreds of years ago. And you can see by the coastline there that it's been ripped apart, and that's from erosion. And so that's another form of landscape change I'm about to talk about. So I wanted to use my mapping software to track those processes. Next slide. So what I did is I took aerial images from 1958, 1970, and 2016, and I overlaid them in my mapping software, and I use this extension on the bottom right that automatically creates transects and measures the distance between coastlines. So next slide. And that produced this. So the red are areas that have eroded and the green are areas that have prograded. So the green areas have increased since 1958, and the red areas have eroded. And the triangles are archaeological sites. And so this type of mapping can help archaeologists to know the best place to excavate if we want to salvage these sites before they are completely eroded. And obviously you wouldn't want to excavate in an area that's increased by 145 meters, because that is going to be sterile deposits, or at least sterile deposits are, it's not going to have anything archaeological in it yet. So next slide. So I'll now bring us to Victoria, and I'll look at some inland ways that landscapes change. And so there's really good examples of this are gold mining, which moved a lot of earth, and also urbanization. So two very good examples of landscape change inland. I don't have time to talk about both, so I'm going to talk about urbanization today in Melbourne's Hoddle Grid, which is the other name for the CBD. And this picture on the right is it created quite a stir because they found a couple of meters of imported fill overlaying building footings. And so basically in the mid 19th century, there was a lot of areas across the Hoddle Grid that were low lying, and they were filling up with liquid and creating lots of public health problems. And so they passed acts of parliament to raise these areas up. And so that photo you see there is an example of an area that we weren't expecting to find 2 meters below the ground. And anyone interested in that can see a newspaper article at the bottom there, which you can Google, which gives you a bit more information. Right, next slide. So this is Melbourne in 1838, a painting. And you can see that Melbourne's Hoddle Grid, this is their CBD area, is situated on undulating ground. And in the middle, going from sort of top to bottom, is a ex-creek called Williams Creek that ran down what is today Elizabeth Street. And on the left, you can see a slight rise, which is Batman's Hill, which was actually removed in the 1860s, or from the 1860s. And so what I wanted to figure out was how this landscape you see in front of you had changed from then to the end of the 19th century, to try and capture that 19th century landscape change. So next slide. So what I did is I took a contour map from 1853, and I traced all the contours in my mapping software, and I created this digital elevation model. So areas in white are high, and areas in that sort of lighter blue are low. And you can see that little point on the bottom left, that's Batman's Hill. So that was the hill I've described that was removed. Next slide. So fortunately, we've got some really good elevation data from 1895 in a series of plans called the MMBW plans. And so I took all that elevation data and I created this model from that. So again, same principles as the last model. And you can already see in that bottom left that there's no longer a hill there. And so, so this basically is a really, just comparing the two models, you can already see some large scale landscape changes. But I wanted to measure the change. So if we go next slide. So I basically created a map that represented the differences between our two models, and the areas in yellow stayed the same, areas in red and orange were lowered, and areas in green increased. Next slide. And so if we zoom into an area, within that dotted line is the approximate area where you saw that photograph, where we know we've got a couple meters of increase. And so right where that arrow is pointing, my model suggested there was 2.29 meters of increase. And so I've basically done this for the whole CBD. And so you can figure out all the areas where you might expect to find archaeological deposits or prior ground surfaces where you might find Aboriginal cultural heritage. And so what we found with this modeling is there are actually a large amount of areas that have increased in elevation where you have prior ground surfaces and archaeological material. Next slide. And so, what's great is the historical record actually substantiates this and talks about specific till events happening in these specific areas that the model collaborates. Next slide. And so, in conclusion, landscapes are not static. They are constantly being transformed through natural and cultural processes. Tracking and modeling how landscapes change through time can help archaeologists to manage and interpret the archaeological record. And Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, is a great way to do that. Thank you.